the afternoon sun of 332 before Christ falls across the coastal plain of Phoenicia. 8,000 men stand on a ridge of rubble that did not exist 3 months ago. They are covered in white dust, their hands blistered from lifting stone under a sky the color of bleached bone. The sea stretches flat and turquoise to their left, but none of them look at it. They are looking at the city of Tyre. It sits on an island half a mile from shore, its walls rising 150 feet above the water. For 7 months, the greatest military commander the world had ever known has been unable to touch it. For 7 months, Alexander of Macedon has stared at a problem his army cannot solve by force of arms alone. And today, standing on that ridge of rubble, he is about to bet everything on a forgotten solution that no commander before him had ever attempted at this scale. What the standard story tells you is that Alexander took Tyre by sheer will and overwhelming aggression. The textbooks say he built a causeway across the sea, rolled his siege towers to the walls, and broke the city through superior engineering and determination. That is true in the way a battlefield report from a victorious general is true. It leaves out the thing that actually decided the siege. It leaves out the factor that almost lost him the war. If you want to understand what happened at Tyre, you have to stop looking at what Alexander did and start looking at what he could not afford to leave behind him. That single factor, what he could not afford to leave behind, is the key that unlocks the entire siege. If you want to keep uncovering these hidden threads that connect ancient decisions to our present world, subscribe to this channel so you never miss a moment when the standard story cracks open. And in the comments, drop the word supply line if you already guessed that Alexander's greatest vulnerability was not on the battlefield, but behind him. The first anomaly is a small one. It sits in the account of the siege written by the historian Arrian, who drew from the diaries of Alexander's own staff. Arrian mentions that in the 2nd month of the siege, Alexander dispatched a fleet of ships from the captured ports of Aradus and Byblos. The number is given as 80 vessels, but he does not explain why 80 ships appeared so suddenly at a siege that had until then been entirely a land operation. Standard military logic says you do not split your resources to build a navy in the middle of a blockade unless you have to. Standard military logic says you do not change your entire strategy mid-siege unless something has gone wrong. Something had gone wrong. That something is the forgotten factor that decided the fate of Tyre. To understand what that factor was, you have to spiral backward in time to a decision Alexander made a full year before he ever reached the walls of Tyre. In the spring of 333 before Christ, Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia with an army of roughly 47,000 men. He had left behind him a Greece that was not pacified. He had left behind a treasury that was nearly empty. His father Philip had spent years building a war chest, and Alexander had spent most of it in the first 6 months of the campaign. The standard narrative says Alexander moved east because he was driven by ambition and the dream of conquering Persia. That is part of the truth, but it is not the part that matters. The part that matters is that Alexander could not afford to leave a single hostile city behind his supply line. Every port, every fortress, every fortified town that stayed loyal to Persia was a knife aimed at his back. He could not resupply by land across the entire breadth of Asia. He had to move by sea, or he would starve. Here is what the military planners of the Persian Empire understood that Alexander's own officers did not. The Persian navy, commanded by the Admiral Memnon of Rhodes, numbered over 400 ships. Alexander had almost no fleet of his own when he crossed into Asia. Most of the Macedonian navy had been disbanded after his father's death, and the ships that remained were scattered along the Greek coast. Memnon's strategy was simple and devastating. He would not fight Alexander's army directly. Instead, his fleet would sail around the Aegean, retake the Greek islands that had submitted to Alexander, and eventually cut off the Macedonian supply lines at the Hellespont itself. Alexander would be stranded in Asia with a victorious army, and no way to defeat it. The plan was sound. It would have worked, and it almost did. If you have ever felt that the history you were taught is incomplete, you know the frustration of being treated as a passive consumer of dates. The Siege of Tyre is taught as a triumph of engineering. What is almost never mentioned is that Alexander was not attacking Tyre because he wanted the city. He was attacking Tyre because he had to destroy the Persian fleet, and he could not do it by sailing out to meet them. He had no ships to match their numbers. His only path was to take every port on the Phoenician coast, one by one, so that the Persian navy had nowhere to dock, nowhere to resupply, nowhere to repair. Tyre was the last and most formidable of those ports. If Tyre held, the Persian fleet would have a base within striking distance of the entire eastern Mediterranean. If Tyre held, Alexander's supply line could be cut in a single season. So the Siege of Tyre was not about a city. It was about a fleet that never directly fought a battle. The forgotten genius of the siege is that Alexander understood that he did not have to defeat the Persian navy in combat. He only had to make its bases disappear. And the only way to make the last base disappear was to build a road to an island that had been unreachable for 1,000 years. The causeway that Alexander built still survives in the geography of modern Tyre. If you stand on the shore today, you are standing on the rubble that his soldiers carried for 7 months. The original island of Tyre was separated from the mainland by a channel that was roughly half a mile wide and up to 18 feet deep. Alexander ordered his men to create a mole, a land bridge made of stone, timber, and earth, pushing out from the mainland toward the island walls. The work was brutal. The Tyrians sent out fire ships that burned the siege towers. They rained arrows and heated sand onto the workers, the sand lodging under armor and burning skin through mail. The causeway was destroyed and rebuilt twice. By the 4th month, Alexander had lost nearly 400 men to the water and the fire. But here is the moment where the forgotten genius reveals itself. In the 5th month, Alexander stopped building the causeway. He had been watching the ships. The navy of the Phoenician cities that had already surrendered to him was sitting idle in his captured ports. He realized he did not have to complete the causeway to reach the walls. He could load his siege engines onto the ships and attack from the sea. The causeway was not the solution. It was the distraction. The Tyrians had focused everything on defending the landward approach, on burning the towers and collapsing the mole. They had left their sea walls less heavily guarded, because no one had ever attacked an island city from the water with siege towers mounted on ships. No one had ever done it, because no one had ever thought of it. Alexander did. That moment of reimagining the impossible is exactly the kind of insight that reshapes our understanding of history. Subscribe to join a community that looks beyond the textbooks at the forgotten genius of improvisation, and in the comments, tell us about another historical innovation that was dismissed until someone tried it. What siege or battle tactic do you think deserves a second look? In the 6th month, 220 ships from the captured Phoenician and Cypriot ports converged on Tyre. They were not warships in the traditional sense. They were transport vessels carrying catapults and ballistae, modified with wooden towers lashed to their decks. Alexander led the assault personally, standing on the deck of a trireme with his armor shining in the sun, a target for every archer on the walls. The bombardment lasted for 3 days. The Tyrian sailors fought back with hooks and firepots, trying to board the ships, trying to set them ablaze. By the end of the 3rd day, a section of the southern wall had collapsed into the sea. The standard narrative says that the breach was the decisive moment. That is the story Alexander wanted told. But there is a second anomaly buried in the accounts. and it is the one that changes everything. Several ancient sources, including Diodorus Siculus and Curtius Rufus, mention that during the final assault, Alexander's ships were suddenly met by a flotilla of 30 Tyrian triremes that had been hidden inside the city's 2 harbors. The 30 ships sailed out in perfect formation, intending to encircle Alexander's fleet from the rear, while the wall defenders held his attention from the front. It was a trap, and it should have worked, but it did not, because Alexander had already seen it coming. He had posted lookouts on the mainland heights, who observed the Tyrian ships being prepared inside the harbors. When the 30 triremes emerged, Alexander had already split his fleet into 2 wings, one to maintain the bombardment and one to meet the sortie head-on. The Tyrian commander watched his flanking plan unravel from the deck of his flagship. He turned back before a single arrow was exchanged. This is the forgotten principle of the Siege of Tyre. Alexander won not because he was the better engineer. He won because he was the better intelligence officer. He did not need to outfight the Tyrians. He needed to outthink every move they made 4 days before they made it. The causeway was a feint. The bombardment was a feint. The real weapon was information. And the source of that information was the network of fishermen, merchants, and deserters that Alexander had cultivated in the captured coastal cities, men who knew the tides and the harbor schedules and the names of the Tyrian captains. That network is never named in the histories. It has no monument, but it was the blade that cut through the walls of Tyre. Stay with me here, because this is the part where the evidence changes the shape of the entire story. When Alexander entered the city after 7 months, he did not celebrate his victory as a triumph of siegecraft. He ordered an execution of 8,000 Tyrian men and the enslavement of 30,000 women and children. The brutality was not random, it was strategic communication. He wanted every remaining city on the coast to know what happened when a siege lasted 7 months. He wanted Gaza, the next city on his path, to see the ashes of Tyre and make a different calculation. Gaza surrendered after 2 months. The standard explanation says Gaza fell because Alexander had perfected his siege technique. The truth is that Gaza fell because Gaza had watched its neighbor be annihilated. The Siege of Tyre was not primarily a military operation. It was a signal, and the signal was received across the entire eastern Mediterranean. The chain of transmission is direct. Every coastal city between Tyre and Egypt opened its gates without a fight. Alexander did not have to spend another year reducing ports. He had spent 7 months building a road across the sea, and the cost of that road was so terrible that no one wanted to see what the next road would look like. The forgotten principle is that Alexander's genius was not in conquering Tyre. It was in making Tyre's destruction so complete that every other city chose surrender without a battle. The siege saved time in the long run because it was so appallingly expensive in the short run. Now, watch what happens when you apply this principle to the rest of Alexander's campaign. Every major victory he achieved after Tyre was preceded by a calculation that the enemy made about the cost of resistance. At Gaugamela, Darius fled the field, not because his army was defeated on the first charge, but because the Persian king had already decided that the risk of capture was not worth the chance of victory. The fear of Alexander had become a weapon in itself. That fear was forged in the smoke of Tyre. But here is the part that the standard narrative leaves in shadow. Alexander's strategy at Tyre almost collapsed for reasons that had nothing to do with Tyrian defenses. In the 4th month of the siege, a letter intercepted by one of Alexander's scouts revealed that a Persian army under the satrap Mazaeus was marching toward the coast from Mesopotamia, intending to relieve Tyre by attacking Alexander's supply depot near Damascus. Alexander had to detach nearly a quarter of his force to intercept Mazaeus before the siege could continue. If Mazaeus had arrived a week earlier, Alexander would have been forced to lift the siege or fight a battle on 2 fronts with the divided army. The Siege of Tyre was not decided by Alexander alone. It was decided by the speed of a courier who got a letter through the desert in 8 days instead of 12. Time is the silent variable in every siege, and it is almost never mentioned in the textbooks. If you have ever felt that history is a sequence of inevitable outcomes, this is the moment where certainty cracks. Tyre could have survived. The entire trajectory of Alexander's campaign could have been different if one Persian official had sealed a letter tighter, or if one scout had ridden slower. The forgotten principle of the siege is not that Alexander was inevitable. It is that he was on the brink of failure repeatedly, and each time he crossed that brink by a margin so narrow that it looks like luck until you examine the patterns of his preparation. The soldiers who carried the stones for the causeway did not know they were building a road to a future that was not guaranteed. They knew only the weight of the rocks on their shoulders and the salt spray on their faces. The fishermen who reported the Tyrian ship movements did not know they were changing the shape of the Mediterranean world for the next 3 centuries. They knew only the coin that Alexander's quartermaster put in their palms at dusk. The Siege of Tyre was not a masterpiece of planning. It was a masterpiece of improvisation under conditions of extreme uncertainty. And the improvisation worked only because Alexander had built an information machine that saw around corners, while everyone else was still looking straight ahead. Which brings us to a question that the histories never answer. After Tyre, Alexander destroyed the Persian fleet by making it obsolete. The ships existed, but they had nowhere to go. What happened to those 400 warships and their 24,000 sailors? They did not disappear. They were absorbed into Alexander's own fleet. The same navy that had almost doomed him became his supply line for the invasion of Egypt. The ships that had carried Memnon's hope of cutting Alexander off from Greece instead carried Alexander's army to the Nile. The forgotten factor is that Alexander did not just defeat his enemy, he metabolized it. The Persian fleet became the Macedonian fleet, crew and all, within weeks of Tyre's fall. This pattern of metabolizing the enemy is Alexander's true legacy, and it's a lesson that still echoes in modern strategy. Subscribe now to stay with us as we follow this thread through Gaugamela and beyond, because the full design of his campaign only reveals itself when you see the connections. In the comments, share the one insight from Tyre that surprised you most: the intelligence network, the feint, or the signal of annihilation. Drop your answer below if you feel this shift in perspective. The Siege of Tyre is not a story of a man who could not be stopped. It is a story of a man who built a system so flexible that every threat became a resource. The causeway, the feint, the intelligence network, the absorption of enemy forces, the signal of annihilation sent to future cities. None of these alone would have won. Together, they formed a pattern that Alexander would repeat 3 more times across 3 continents. And the pattern started with a pile of rubble that did not exist 3 months before the afternoon sun fell on 8,000 tired men in 332 before Christ. The next time you hear a story of an inevitable victory, ask who built the intelligence network. Ask what was intercepted. Ask what letter almost arrived too late. The forgotten genius at Tyre was not in the siege towers, it was in the listening.